Billionaire's pregnant ex-wife collapses on the street. What unfolds next will leave you speechless. Hello, my beautiful family. How are you all doing? Please let me know in the comments. I love hearing from you. My dear viewers, I pour my heart and soul into creating these beautiful stories for you every single day, but lately, seeing my views go down has been truly heartbreaking. Your support, your comments, and your love mean the world to me and inspire me to keep crafting heartwarming stories that touch your hearts. Please stay connected with me and don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more inspiring and emotional tales. Your support keeps this dream alive. Now, without further ado, let's dive into today's story. Claire Blackwood, once the radiant wife of billionaire Adrian Blackwood, now lived a life far removed from the glittering halls of wealth and privilege. After their divorce, the world she knew crumbled around her. She was no longer the woman who wore designer gowns or attended lavish galas. She was just Claire, a pregnant woman fighting to survive in a city that never slowed down for anyone. Adrian's betrayal still stung. Their marriage had been a whirlwind of passion, but it ended in bitterness. Adrian had become distant, consumed by the demands of his empire, and Claire had felt like an afterthought in her own marriage. When she finally walked away, she did so with her head held high, not knowing she carried more than just heartbreak. She carried their child, but life outside the Blackwood fortune was unforgiving. Claire took a job as a waitress at a small diner downtown. The hours were long, the pay meager, and the work physically demanding, especially for someone in her condition. She rented a tiny apartment that barely fit her belongings, let alone her dreams for the future. Yet she told herself she would endure it all for the sake of her unborn child. She was determined to give her baby a life filled with love, even if she had to do it alone. That evening, the rain fell in soft drizzles, blanketing the city streets in a reflective sheen. Claire had just finished her shift, her feet aching from hours of standing, her back sore from bending over tables. She wrapped her thin coat tighter around her growing belly as she stepped out into the cold night. Her co-workers had offered her a ride, but she didn't want to be a burden. She always insisted she was fine, even when she wasn't. As she walked down the dimly lit sidewalk, Claire's mind raced with worry. The rent was due in a week, and she was already behind on her medical bills. She hadn't seen a doctor in months because she couldn't afford it. The weight of her struggles pressed down on her, both physically and emotionally. She tried to focus on the sound of her baby's heartbeat, a memory from her last checkup. It had been strong and steady, a tiny reminder of hope in her stormy life. But tonight, something felt off. Claire had been feeling weak all day, and the cramps in her abdomen were becoming more frequent. She chalked it up to exhaustion. After all, she hadn't eaten much since breakfast. The diner allowed staff meals, but Claire often skipped hers to save every dollar she could. Just a few more blocks, she whispered to herself, clutching her belly protectively. The city buzzed around her, indifferent to her pain. People hurried past with umbrellas and coats, their faces shadowed by the rain. Claire felt invisible, a ghost among the living. She stumbled slightly, her breath hitching as a sharp pain shot through her side. She paused, leaning against a lamppost to steady herself. A wave of nausea hit her and her vision blurred. "Not now. Please, not now," Claire muttered, her voice trembling. She tried to take a step forward, but her legs wobbled beneath her. Her breathing became shallow and panic set in. She was alone, vulnerable, and terrified. The bustling street seemed to close in around her, the sounds of the city fading into a dull hum. Claire's knees buckled, and she crumpled to the ground. Her arms instinctively wrapped around her belly as she hit the wet pavement. The pain was unbearable now, radiating through her body. She gasped for air, tears streaming down her face. "My baby," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, Be okay." A small crowd began to gather, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. Some pulled out their phones to call for help, while others just stared, unsure of what to do. Claire could hear their muffled voices, but she couldn't respond. Her body felt heavy, her strength slipping away with each passing second. "Someone! Call an ambulance!" a voice shouted, cutting through the haze. A young woman knelt beside Claire, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Ma'am, can you hear me? Help is on the way." Claire tried to nod, but her body refused to cooperate. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "My baby. Please, save my baby." The young woman's face softened with compassion. "You're going to be okay. Just hang on." The minutes felt like hours as Claire lay there, rain soaking through her clothes. Her thoughts drifted to Adrian, the man she had once loved with all her heart. She wondered if he even knew she was pregnant, if he would have cared. Despite everything, a part of her wished he were there, holding her hand, telling her everything would be fine. As the sirens wailed in the distance, Claire's vision darkened. The last thing she saw was the kind stranger's reassuring smile before everything went black. The crowd around Claire grew larger by the second, but no one seemed to know what to do. Some stared in confusion, others murmured among themselves, and a few took out their phones to film or make calls. The rain intensified, soaking the ground where Claire lay unconscious. Her frail form, drenched and trembling, painted a tragic picture of someone forgotten by the world. Then, a figure pushed through the crowd with urgency. Tall and composed, despite the chaos, the man's eyes scanned the scene until they landed on Claire. His expression shifted from confusion to recognition, and he wasted no time kneeling by her side. "Nathan?" Someone from the diner staff recognized him. Adrian's assistant was a known face in the city's elite circles, frequently seen handling high-profile matters for his boss. But here, Nathan wasn't the poised professional people knew. He was a man with genuine concern etched into his face. He gently touched Claire's shoulder, feeling the coldness of her soaked skin. Her lips were pale, her breathing shallow. The crowd buzzed louder, offering unsolicited advice. "Step back," Nathan commanded, his voice calm yet firm. "She needs air." The authority in his tone silenced the chatter. Nathan leaned closer to Claire and spoke softly, as though she could still hear him. "Claire, it's Nathan. You're going to be okay. I'm here to help." Her head lolled slightly, a faint whimper escaping her lips. He hesitated for a moment, his mind racing. He could call for an ambulance, but what if it took too long? Claire's condition seemed critical, and he couldn't risk waiting. He knew the city too well, and how emergencies sometimes got lost in its relentless pace. Without another thought, he slipped his arms beneath her and lifted her off the ground. "Sir, are you sure?" a bystander asked, looking concerned. "She's pregnant," Nathan replied, glancing down at Claire's belly. "She can't afford to wait." The rain continued to fall as Nathan carried Claire toward his car, parked just a block away. Each step felt like a marathon as he shielded her from the rain with his coat. Claire's head rested limply against his chest, her breaths faint but steady. Nathan opened the car door and carefully placed her in the back seat, adjusting her so she was lying as comfortably as possible. He removed his scarf and tucked it around her neck, hoping to provide some warmth. Claire's face was pale, her expression peaceful yet fragile. As he started the car, Nathan's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. His mind was a storm of questions. How had it come to this? How had Claire, once the glowing wife of his boss, ended up collapsing alone on a rainy street? And why hadn't she reached out for help? As he sped toward the hospital, Nathan pulled out his phone and made a call. It rang twice before a deep voice answered. "Nathan? What is it?" "Adrian, it's Claire," Nathan said, his voice tense. There was silence on the other end before Adrian responded, his tone sharper now. "What about Claire?" "I found her," Nathan continued, glancing at Claire in the rearview mirror. "She collapsed in the street. She's pregnant." "Pregnant?" Adrian's voice faltered, disbelief and worry evident. "Yes, sir. I'm taking her to Mercy General Hospital. You should get there quickly." "I'm on my way," Adrian said, his voice urgent before hanging up. Nathan focused on the road, driving as fast as he could without compromising their safety. Every red light felt like an eternity, and every passing second weighed heavily on him. In the rearview mirror, Claire stirred slightly, murmuring incoherently. "Hold on, Claire," Nathan whispered, gripping the wheel tighter. "We're almost there." When he finally pulled up to the hospital, Nathan leaped out of the car and ran to the passenger side. Nurses and orderlies were already rushing toward him, alerted by a call he'd made earlier. "She's pregnant," Nathan explained, as he gently handed Claire over to the waiting stretcher. She collapsed and was unconscious for at least 10 minutes. The medical staff nodded, quickly wheeling her inside. Nathan followed close behind, his heart racing as he watched her disappear through the double doors of the emergency room. He stood there, drenched and trembling, not from the rain, but from the weight of the moment. Adrian arrived moments later, his presence commanding attention as he entered the hospital. Dressed in a sharp suit that was now slightly rumpled from his rushed journey, his usual air of control was replaced with visible anxiety. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on Nathan. "Where is she?" Adrian demanded, his voice hoarse. "She's in the ER," Nathan replied, his calm demeanor never faltering despite the tension in the air. "The doctors are with her now." Adrian's jaw tightened, and he looked toward the doors where Claire had been taken. For the first time in years, he felt utterly powerless. His mind swirled with guilt and confusion. How had Claire ended up in such a state, and why hadn't she told him about the baby? Nathan placed a hand on Adrian's shoulder. "She'll be okay, sir. She's strong, and she's fighting for more than just herself now." Adrian nodded, though his heart remained heavy. As the minutes ticked by, he sat in the waiting area, his head in his hands. Nathan stayed beside him, silent but steadfast. Unbeknownst to Adrian, Nathan had always been quietly watching. He had seen the cracks in Adrian and Claire's marriage long before it fell apart, and he had witnessed how the divorce had hardened Adrian, turning him into a man who buried himself in work to avoid his emotions. But seeing Claire like this, fragile and vulnerable, seemed to awaken something in Adrian. Nathan hoped this would be the moment his boss finally realized what truly mattered. As the waiting room buzzed with activity, Adrian sat motionless, his thoughts consumed by Claire. He didn't know what he would say to her when she woke up, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't let her face this alone ever again. Nathan, standing in the corner, silently prayed that Claire and the baby would be okay. For years, he had been Adrian's loyal assistant, but in this moment, he was more than that. He was the bridge between two people who had once loved each other deeply, and he knew their story wasn't over yet. The opulent boardroom of Blackwood Enterprises was filled with the hum of important conversation. Seated at the head of a polished oak table, Adrian Blackwood radiated the authority of a man who had built an empire from the ground up. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, his sharp eyes scanned the financial projections on the screen. His team waited for his response with bated breath. Everyone knew Adrian was a man who rarely faltered, but even as the discussion continued around him, Adrian's mind wasn't fully present. Lately, there had been a gnawing emptiness he couldn't shake, an echo of regrets he didn't dare voice. He thought of Claire, his ex-wife, more often than he cared to admit. Though their divorce had been finalized months ago, Her absence lingered like a shadow in his life. He'd buried himself in work to suppress the guilt, convincing himself that letting her go had been for the best. "Mr. Blackwood, your thoughts?" one of the executives asked, pulling Adrian from his reverie. Before Adrian could respond, his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen, irritation flickering across his face at the interruption. But when he saw the caller ID, Nathan, his assistant who never called without reason, his irritation gave way to concern. "Excuse me," Adrian said curtly, picking up the phone and stepping out of the boardroom. "Nathan, this better be important." "Sir," Nathan's voice came through, urgent and breathless. "It's Claire." Adrian froze mid-step, the color draining from his face. "What about Claire?" "She collapsed in the street. I found her on my way back from a meeting. She's unconscious, and, sir, she's pregnant." For a moment, Adrian couldn't speak. The words hung in the air, each one hitting him like a physical blow. Collapsed? Pregnant? His mind struggled to process the information. "Pregnant?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes," Nathan confirmed, his tone grave. "I've taken her to Mercy General. You need to come, now." Adrian's grip tightened on the phone. "I'm on my way." He hung up and stood there for a moment, his chest rising and falling with the weight of emotions he hadn't felt in years. Bursting back into the boardroom, Adrian's colleagues looked up in surprise as he grabbed his coat. "The meeting is over," he announced, his tone sharp and final. "Send me the minutes." Without waiting for a response, he strode out, leaving his team exchanging bewildered glances. Adrian's driver was waiting outside, but impatience burned in his veins. "Get me to Mercy General as fast as possible," he barked as he slid into the back seat. As the car weaved through traffic, Adrian leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his head in his hands. The thought of Claire, lying unconscious somewhere, twisted his gut with guilt and worry. And then there was the other bombshell. She was pregnant, with his child. How had he not known? Had she tried to tell him? He replayed their last conversations in his head, searching for clues he might have missed. He had been so consumed with work, so focused on saving his company during a financial crisis, that he'd shut her out entirely. He had justified it then, telling himself he was doing it for her, for their future, but now, sitting in the back of a speeding car, he saw it for what it really was. Cowardice. He had walked away, leaving her to fend for herself. And now she was pregnant, vulnerable, and in danger. The realization clawed at his chest, and for the first time in years, Adrian felt truly powerless. The car screeched to a halt in front of the hospital. Adrian barely waited for the door to open before he jumped out, striding through the automatic doors with the urgency of a man on a mission. "Nathan," he called, spotting his assistant in the waiting area. Nathan stood, his usually calm demeanor tinged with unease. "She's in the ER, he said, gesturing toward the double doors. "The doctors are with her now. She's stable, but they're running tests to make sure the baby's okay." Adrian's jaw tightened. The word baby felt surreal to him, yet it was enough to send a fresh wave of guilt crashing over him. He looked toward the doors, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Did she say anything?" Nathan hesitated. "Before she lost consciousness, she said something about the baby. She asked us to keep the baby safe." Adrian's chest tightened, and he felt a lump form in his throat. He had always prided himself on being in control, but hearing those words broke something inside him. Claire had been out there, alone, fighting for their child while he had been sitting in boardrooms. Oblivious. "I'll wait here," Adrian muttered, his voice hoarse as he sank into one of the chairs in the waiting area. Nathan sat beside him, the silence between them heavy with unspoken emotions. Minutes felt like hours as Adrian replayed every moment of his marriage in his mind. He thought of Claire's laughter, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about their dreams of a family. He had promised her the world, only to leave her standing in its rubble. A doctor finally emerged from the ER, his face calm but serious. Adrian shot to his feet. "How is she?" "She's stable," the doctor said, his voice measured. "She's dehydrated and malnourished, but we've started IV fluids, and she's responding well. The baby's heart rate is steady, but the pregnancy is fragile. She'll need rest and proper care moving forward." Adrian let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Relief washed over him, but it was quickly replaced by determination. He wouldn't let Claire face this alone any longer. "Can I see her?" he asked, his voice softer now. The doctor nodded. "She's resting, but a familiar face might help." Adrian exchanged a glance with Nathan before following the doctor through the double doors. His heart pounded as he approached Claire's room, unsure of what he would say or how she would react. When he stepped inside, his breath caught. Claire lay on the hospital bed, her face pale but peaceful. An IV line ran into her arm, and her hands rested protectively over her belly. She looked so small, so fragile, yet there was a quiet strength about her that left Adrian in awe. He approached the bed cautiously, afraid to wake her, but as he drew closer, Claire's eyelids fluttered open, her gaze landed on him, and for a moment confusion flickered in her eyes before it was replaced by something colder. "Adrian," she said, her voice weak but steady. He swallowed hard, guilt and regret weighing down his every word. "Claire, I'm so sorry." Her eyes narrowed slightly, and despite her exhaustion, she found the strength to speak. "What are you doing here?" Adrian hesitated, his throat tightening. "I came as soon as I heard. Nathan told me what happened." Claire's lips trembled, tears welling in her eyes. "It's too late for apologies, Adrian. You weren't there when I needed you most." Her words cut through him like a knife, but he didn't back down. "I know I failed you, Claire. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm here now, and I won't leave again. Not you, not the baby." For the first time, Claire's hardened expression softened, and a tear slipped down her cheek. Adrian reached out, his hand hovering over hers. "Please, let me make this right." Claire stared at him, torn between the pain of the past and the glimmer of hope in his voice. As the silence stretched between them, Adrian silently vowed to do whatever it took to earn her trust again, for her, for the baby, and for the love they once shared. Adrian pushed open the door to Claire's hospital room, his breath hitching as he stepped inside. The sterile scent of antiseptics and the steady beeping of the heart monitor filled the small space. His eyes immediately found Claire, lying motionless on the hospital bed. Her skin was pale, her face thinner than he remembered, and dark circles framed her closed eyes. For a man who had always prided himself on being in control, the sight of her like this shattered something deep inside him. His heart clenched as he took in every detail: her frailty, the IV line running into her arm, the soft rise and fall of her chest. She looked so fragile, so different from the vibrant woman he had fallen in love with years ago. Adrian's footsteps were slow and deliberate as he approached her bedside. He didn't realize he was holding his breath until he exhaled, the sound shaky and uneven. Pulling up a chair, he sat down and allowed himself a moment to simply watch her, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Guilt weighed heavily on him as memories of their life together flooded his mind. He thought of the laughter they once shared, the quiet evenings spent dreaming about their future, and the love that had once been so undeniable. And then he thought of the way he had walked away, consumed by his own ambitions, convinced that his absence was for the best. Adrian reached out tentatively, his hand hovering over hers. He hesitated, afraid that touching her might break the fragile peace of the moment. Instead, he let his hand drop to his lap, clenching it into a fist as frustration with himself bubbled to the surface. "You deserve so much better," he murmured, his eyes stinging with unshed tears. "I should have been there for you, for both of you." The door creaked open, and Adrian turned to see a nurse entering the room. She gave him a polite nod as she checked Claire's vitals. "She's stable," the nurse said softly, sensing the tension in the room. "But she'll need rest and proper care moving forward. The baby seems to be fine for now, but we'll monitor them closely." Adrian nodded, unable to speak. The nurse left quietly, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the woman he had once called his everything. As the minutes ticked by, Adrian leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees and burying his face in his hands. He stayed like that until he heard a faint rustling. His head shot up, and his heart skipped a beat as he saw Claire's eyelids flutter open. Her eyes, once so full of life, now seemed dull and tired as they focused on him. At first there was confusion in her gaze, but it quickly morphed into something colder. Anger. "Adrian," she said, her voice weak but laced with disbelief. He straightened, his heart pounding. "Claire," he said softly, relief washing over him at the sound of her voice. "You're awake. Thank God." But Claire didn't share his relief. Tears welled in her eyes as she turned her head away from him, her lips trembling. "Why are you here?" she asked, her tone sharp, despite her exhaustion. Adrian flinched at the question, guilt tightening his chest. Nathan called me," he admitted. "He told me what happened. I came as soon as I could." Her eyes snapped back to his, now filled with a mix of anger and pain. "You shouldn't have," she said, her voice breaking. "You left me, Adrian. You left me when I needed you most." The words hit him like a physical blow. Adrian opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He had prepared himself for many possibilities, but nothing could have prepared him for the raw pain in her voice. "Do you know what it's like?" Claire continued, tears streaming down her face. "To wake up every day alone, wondering how you're going to make it through, to carry this baby, your baby, and have no one to lean on?" Adrian's throat tightened as he listened, his own eyes stinging with unshed tears. "Claire, I didn't know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't know because you didn't care enough to ask," she snapped, her voice rising despite her weakened state. "You were too busy with your empire, your meetings, your billion-dollar deals. I was nothing to you, Adrian. Nothing." "Stop," Adrian pleaded, his voice cracking. "Don't say that. You were never nothing to me. I thought I was doing the right thing by walking away. I thought I was giving you a chance to be happy." Claire let out a bitter laugh, the sound filled with hurt. "Happy? You think I was happy? You think I wanted to raise this baby alone, struggling to make ends meet?" Adrian leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the bed as he met her gaze. "I was wrong, Claire. I was selfish and blind, and I see that now. But I'm here. I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Claire's eyes searched his face, as if trying to determine whether his words were genuine. The silence between them was heavy, punctuated only by the steady beeping of the heart monitor. "I don't know if I can trust you," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I can let you back into my life, Adrian." His chest ached at her words, but he nodded, accepting the truth in them. "I understand," he said softly. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I don't expect it, but I'm going to fight for it, Claire. For you. For the baby." Claire looked away, her tears falling freely now. She didn't respond, and Adrian didn't press her. He sat back in the chair, his hands clasped tightly together, and vowed silently to prove himself. Hours passed, and the room grew quiet again. Claire eventually fell back into a restless sleep, her face still etched with the pain of their past. Adrian stayed by her side, watching over her and the life growing inside her, determined to make up for every moment he had missed. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, Adrian felt a flicker of hope. This was his chance to make things right, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. The silence in the hospital room hung heavy, broken only by the faint beeping of the heart monitor. Adrian sat by Claire's bedside, his hands gripping his knees as he tried to summon the courage to speak. The tension between them was palpable, and the weight of everything unsaid pressed down on him like a suffocating blanket. Claire lay back against the pillows, her arms crossed over her chest protectively. Her eyes, still red from crying, were fixed on him, daring him to speak. "You said you came here to make things right," she said, her voice sharp but tinged with exhaustion. "Then start explaining. Why did you leave, Adrian? Why did you throw everything away?" Adrian's jaw tightened as he looked down at his hands, unable to meet her piercing gaze. He had rehearsed this conversation 1,000 times in his mind, but now that it was here, the words felt stuck in his throat. "I thought I was protecting you," he said finally, his voice low. Claire scoffed, shaking her head. "Protecting me? By walking away? That's a new one, Adrian." He flinched at the bitterness in her tone, but pressed on. "You don't understand, Claire. At the time, everything was falling apart. The company, my family's legacy, was on the verge of bankruptcy. I had creditors breathing down my neck, deals falling through, and lawsuits piling up. I was fighting fires everywhere, trying to keep the empire from crumbling, and I didn't want you to get dragged down with me." Claire stared at him, her expression unreadable. "So, you thought the best solution was to leave me, to cut me out of your life completely?" Adrian nodded, slowly, his throat tightening. "I thought, if I let you go, you'd be free from all of it. You wouldn't have to suffer the fallout. I didn't want you to lose everything." "And what about what I lost, Adrian?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Do you even realize what you did to me? You didn't give me a choice. You didn't trust me enough to face it together. You just decided for both of us." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. Adrian looked up at her, his eyes filled with regret. "I know I was wrong, Claire. I thought I was doing the right thing, but all I did was hurt you. I see that now." Claire's lips trembled as she sat up straighter, her hands instinctively resting on her belly. "You didn't just hurt me, Adrian. You abandoned me. I tried to tell you, I tried so many times, but you were always too busy, too consumed with your empire to notice." Adrian frowned, confusion flickering across his face. "Tried to tell me? Tell me what?" Claire let out a bitter laugh, tears streaming down her face. "About the baby, Adrian. About this little life I was carrying. I found out I was pregnant just before you left. I was terrified and excited and desperate to share it with you, but every time I tried, you brushed me off." Adrian's breath caught, his chest tightening as her words sank in. You knew before the divorce?" She nodded, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. "I thought if I could just get you to slow down for one moment, you'd listen. But you didn't. And then you left, and I was alone. I had to figure out how to survive, how to prepare for this baby. Without you." Adrian felt as though the air had been knocked out of him. He leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling. All this time he had thought he was sparing Claire from his burdens, only to realize he had abandoned her in her moment of greatest need. "Claire," he began, his voice breaking, "I didn't know. If I had—" "But you didn't," she interrupted, her voice laced with anger and pain. "You didn't know because you weren't there. You didn't even care enough to notice what was happening in my life. Do you have any idea how hard it's been? Working long hours at a diner just to make ends meet? Worrying every day if I'm doing enough to keep this baby safe." Adrian's heart ached at her words. He wanted to reach out to comfort her, but he knew he didn't have the right. Not yet. "Claire, I've made so many mistakes. I was selfish and blind, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But I swear to you, I'm here now. I want to be here for you, for the baby." Claire shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "Do you know how many nights I cried myself to sleep, Adrian? How many times I begged God to help me understand why you left? You broke me, and now you expect me to just— what? Forgive you because you feel guilty?" "No," Adrian said firmly, his voice trembling with emotion. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I know I don't deserve it. But I'm going to fight for it, Claire. For you. For this family. I'll do whatever it takes to prove that I'm not the same man who walked away." Claire's gaze softened slightly, but the pain in her eyes remained. She looked down at her hands, her fingers gently tracing circles over her belly. "This baby deserves better, Adrian. Better than what we've been." Adrian nodded, his jaw clenching as he fought back his own tears. "You're right. And I promise you, Claire, I'm going to be better. I'll be the father this child deserves, and I'll do everything in my power to support you, no matter what it takes." The room fell silent again, the weight of their shared pain hanging between them. For the first time, Adrian truly understood the depth of what he had lost, and what he still stood to gain. Claire turned her head to look out the window, her expression thoughtful. "I don't know if I can trust you again, Adrian," she said quietly. "I'll earn it," he replied without hesitation. "Even if it takes the rest of my life, I'll earn your trust." She didn't respond, but the faintest flicker of hope passed across her face. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. Adrian leaned back in his chair, determination burning in his chest. This wasn't the end of their story, it was the beginning of something new. And this time, he was determined to do things right. The tension in the room was suffocating as Claire turned her face away from Adrian, her emotions a swirling storm of anger, sadness, and confusion. Adrian sat on the edge of his seat, his gaze fixed on her, desperate to bridge the gap between them. But before he could say anything else, the door to the room swung open and a doctor stepped inside, clipboard in hand. "Excuse me," the doctor said, his tone professional but somber. "I need to speak with both of you about Claire's condition." Adrian immediately stood, his heart racing. "What is it, doctor? Is something wrong?" Claire's hand instinctively moved to her belly, her face paling. "Please, just tell me. Is my baby okay?" The doctor sighed, his expression gentle but serious. "The baby is stable for now, but there are complications we need to address immediately. Claire, your body is under significant strain due to stress and malnutrition. These factors are putting both you and the baby at risk." Claire's breath hitched, her eyes widening with fear. "What do you mean by at risk?" The doctor pulled up a chair and sat across from her, his voice calm but firm. "Your blood pressure is elevated, and you're showing signs of severe exhaustion. If we don't address these issues, It could lead to preterm labor or other serious complications for both you and the baby. We need to monitor you closely and ensure you're getting the proper nutrition and rest." Adrian's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his protective instincts kicking into overdrive. "What can we do to fix this? What does she need?" The doctor glanced at Adrian before turning back to Claire. "She needs a low-stress environment, a balanced diet, and regular medical checkups. This isn't something she can manage alone. It's critical that she has support." Claire's face crumpled as tears spilled down her cheeks. She felt overwhelmed, terrified, and helpless. The weight of trying to survive on her own, combined with the fear of losing her baby, was too much to bear. Adrian stepped closer to her bed, his voice resolute. "Then she'll have it. I'll make sure she gets everything she needs." Claire's head snapped up, and she shot him a glare through her tears. "No," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't need your help, Adrian. I've managed this far without you." Adrian knelt beside her, his eyes filled with a mix of determination and pleading. "Claire, this isn't about pride or proving you can do it alone. This is about you and our baby. I've failed you once, but I won't fail you again. Let me help." The doctor cleared his throat, sensing the tension. "I'll give you two a moment to discuss," he said, before leaving the room. The silence that followed was heavy. Claire wiped her tears, her hand still protectively cradling her belly. "I don't need your charity, Adrian," she said quietly, her voice laced with defiance. Adrian's heart ached at her words, but he refused to back down. "This isn't charity, Claire. This is responsibility. It's me stepping up and doing what I should have done from the start. You don't have to trust me or forgive me right now, but you can't deny that the baby needs more than you can give on your own." Claire bit her lip, her resolve wavering. Deep down, she knew he was right. The doctor's words had scared her, and the thought of losing her baby was unbearable. But accepting Adrian's help felt like admitting defeat, like she couldn't do it on her own. "I don't want to depend on you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're not depending on me," Adrian said gently. "You're giving our child the best chance at a healthy start. That's all that matters right now." Tears streamed down her face as she wrestled with her emotions. She didn't want to give Adrian the satisfaction of being her savior, but her baby's safety came first. "I don't trust you, Adrian," she said finally. "Not yet. I understand," he said, his voice steady. "But I'll earn your trust, Claire. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure you and the baby are okay." Claire hesitated, her fingers tracing circles over her belly. The idea of leaving her small apartment and accepting Adrian's help felt overwhelming, but the doctor's words echoed in her mind. This wasn't about her pride, it was about her baby. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked, her tone cautious. Adrian leaned forward, his voice calm and measured. "Come to my estate. I have the resources to give you everything you need. A private doctor, a nutritionist, a safe and comfortable place to rest. You won't have to worry about anything, just focus on getting better." Claire frowned, her instincts telling her to resist. But the truth was, she didn't have many options. Her job at the diner barely covered her bills, and the stress of trying to make ends meet was taking a toll on her body. "And what happens after the baby is born?" she asked, her voice laced with skepticism. "We'll cross that bridge when we get to it," Adrian said honestly. "Right now, the priority is making sure you both make it through this safely." She studied him, searching his face for any sign of ulterior motives. For the first time, she saw something raw and vulnerable in his expression, genuine concern, maybe even guilt. "Fine," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll go. But this doesn't mean I've forgiven you, Adrian. And it doesn't mean I trust you." "I understand," he said softly. "You don't have to forgive me or trust me yet. All I care about is keeping you and the baby safe." Claire looked away, fresh tears slipping down her cheeks. She hated how vulnerable she felt, how much she still cared about Adrian despite everything. But for now, she pushed those feelings aside. Her baby was what mattered most, and if going with Adrian meant giving her child a better chance, she would do it. As Adrian called Nathan to make arrangements, Claire rested her hand on her belly, whispering a silent promise to her unborn child. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect you," she murmured. And for the first time in months, she allowed herself to hope. The black car came to a stop in front of a sprawling mansion, its grand facade illuminated by the golden glow of the setting sun. Claire sat in the passenger seat, staring at the house that had once been her home. It was just as she remembered, majestic and imposing, with perfectly manicured lawns and ivy trailing along the stone walls. But to Claire, it was more than just a house. It was a place that held echoes of a life she had tried to leave behind. Adrian stepped out of the car first, walking around to open her door. "We're here," he said softly, his voice careful, as if he feared she might bolt. Claire hesitated, her hand resting on her belly as she looked at him, then back at the mansion. Memories flooded her mind, the nights they had spent laughing in the living room, the quiet mornings on the balcony, the way Adrian used to twirl her around the marble floor as music played softly in the background. It all felt like a lifetime ago. "I don't know if I can do this," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "You don't have to decide anything right now," Adrian said, his tone gentle. "Just take it one step at a time. This is about you and the baby, nothing else." With a deep breath, Claire finally stepped out of the car. The cool evening air brushed against her skin as she took in the sight of the place that once felt like a sanctuary. Adrian walked beside her, keeping a respectful distance, and opened the grand front door. The interior of the mansion was as breathtaking as she remembered, with its high ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and polished wooden floors. The faint scent of lavender lingered in the air, just as it had years ago. It was like stepping back into the past, and for a moment Claire felt a pang of longing mixed with bitterness. Adrian led her to a cozy sitting room just off the main hall. "I had the staff prepare a suite for you upstairs," he said, "but if you'd prefer, you can rest here for a while." Claire sank into one of the plush armchairs, her hand still protectively resting on her belly. "This house, it's the same," she said quietly, her eyes scanning the room. "Everything looks the same." Adrian sat across from her, his expression unreadable. "I couldn't bring myself to change it," he admitted. "It felt wrong, like I'd be erasing something important." Claire looked at him, surprised by his honesty. She hadn't expected him to be so open, so vulnerable. It was a side of Adrian she hadn't seen in a long time. As the days passed, Claire began to settle into the mansion. The suite Adrian had prepared for her was spacious and comfortable, with a balcony overlooking the garden. A private doctor and nutritionist visited regularly, ensuring she and the baby were healthy. Adrian was true to his word. He gave her the space she needed, never pushing her to talk or forgive him. But the house itself seemed determined to stir her emotions. Every corner, every room held memories of their time together. The dining room where they had shared candlelit dinners, the library where they had spent hours reading and talking, the garden where Adrian had once surprised her with a picnic under the stars. One afternoon, As Claire walked through the hallway, her eyes landed on a familiar photo hanging on the wall. It was a picture of the two of them on their honeymoon, both smiling brightly. She reached out to touch the frame, her fingers brushing against the glass. "I couldn't bring myself to take that down." Adrian's voice came from behind her, startling her. Claire turned to find him standing a few steps away, his hands in his pockets. "Why not?" she asked, her tone guarded. Adrian hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Because it reminds me of what I lost, of what I threw away." Claire's heart ached at his words, but she quickly pushed the feeling aside. "It's just a picture," she said, turning away. "It's more than that," Adrian replied softly. "It's a reminder of the best moments of my life." Claire didn't respond. Instead, she walked past him and headed to the garden, needing some air. The mansion was beautiful, but it was suffocating in its familiarity. Everywhere she turned, she was reminded of what they had been, of the love they had once shared. As she sat on a bench in the garden, the sound of birds chirping in the distance, she allowed herself to remember. She thought about the Adrian she had fallen in love with, the man who had made her laugh, who had held her when she cried, who had promised to protect her from the world. Despite her resentment, she couldn't deny that Adrian was different now. He was patient, kind, and attentive in a way he hadn't been before. He made sure she had everything she needed, but he never overstepped, never tried to force his way back into her life. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table, Adrian broke the silence. "Do you remember the first time we ate here?" he asked, a small smile tugging at his lips. Claire looked up from her plate, her expression guarded. "Barely." Adrian chuckled softly. "You were so nervous. You kept tapping your fork against the plate, and I couldn't stop teasing you about it." A reluctant smile crossed Claire's face. "You were insufferable," she admitted. "But you laughed," Adrian said, his tone warm. "And I knew in that moment that I wanted to spend the rest of my life making you laugh." Claire's smile faded as a wave of sadness washed over her. "Well, things didn't exactly work out that way, did they?" Adrian's expression grew serious. "No, they didn't. But I'd like to believe it's not too late to make things right." Claire looked down at her hands, her emotions a tangled mess. She didn't know if she could ever fully forgive Adrian, but she couldn't deny the effort he was making, and as much as she tried to fight it, part of her still cared for him. The mansion, with all its memories, was beginning to feel less like a prison and more like a place of healing. As Claire continued to recover, she found herself letting down her guard, little by little. The wounds of the past were still raw, but for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward. The soft glow of the fireplace illuminated the room as Adrian and Claire sat on opposite ends of the large, elegantly furnished living room. The warmth from the flames filled the space, but Claire felt a distinct chill in her heart. She wasn't sure why Adrian had asked to talk that evening, but the serious look on his face suggested it was something significant. "Claire," Adrian began, his voice calm but tinged with nervousness. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you for a long time, but I wasn't sure how to bring it up." Claire raised an eyebrow, her guard immediately up. "What is it now, Adrian? Another apology? Another explanation for why you left me?" Adrian winced at her tone, but didn't let it deter him. "This is different," he said, leaning forward slightly. "It's about something I did before the divorce." Claire narrowed her eyes, crossing her arms over her chest. "Before the divorce? You mean when you were shutting me out and pretending like I didn't exist?" Adrian sighed, running a hand through his hair. I deserve that, he admitted. But please, just hear me out. She hesitated, but eventually nodded, gesturing for him to continue. Adrian took a deep breath, his gaze steady. Before we finalized the divorce, I set up a trust fund in your name. I wanted to make sure that no matter what happened between us, you would always be taken care of. Claire blinked, stunned. For a moment, she wasn't sure if she had heard him correctly. A trust fund, she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. Yes, Adrian said quietly. It's been there all along. I've been adding to it every year. I know it doesn't make up for what I did, but I needed to know that you'd have something to fall back on, even if I wasn't in your life anymore. Claire stared at him, her emotions swirling in a storm of confusion, anger, and something she couldn't quite name. Why didn't you tell me? She demanded. Adrian hesitated, his eyes dropping to the floor. Because I thought it would hurt you more to know. I thought it would seem like I was trying to buy your forgiveness or absolve myself of guilt. And back then, I thought I was doing the right thing by letting you go. I thought I was protecting you. Protecting me. Claire's voice cracked as she repeated his words. Do you have any idea how much you hurt me, Adrian? You didn't protect me. You abandoned me. Her words hit him like a physical blow, but he didn't try to defend himself. Instead, he nodded, his expression filled with regret. I know, he said softly, and I've regretted it every day since. Claire stood, pacing the room as she tried to process what he was telling her. So you just decided what was best for me without even talking to me. You thought money could fix everything? It was never about the money, Adrian said quickly, standing as well. I didn't do it to fix anything. I did it because I cared about you, Claire. I've always cared about you. Even when I walked away, I never stopped. Claire stopped pacing and turned to face him, her eyes brimming with tears. If you cared so much, why didn't you fight for us? Why didn't you stay and try to work things out instead of running away? Adrian stepped closer to her, his voice filled with raw emotion. Because I thought I was sparing you, he admitted. My family's business was on the verge of collapse. I was drowning in debt and pressure, and I didn't want to drag you down with me. I thought I was being selfless by letting you go, but I see now that I was just a coward. Claire's tears spilled over as she listened to his confession. She had spent so many nights wondering why Adrian had walked away, blaming herself for their marriage falling apart. Hearing the truth didn't erase the pain, but it gave her a glimpse of the man she had fallen in love with, the man who had always tried to protect her even in the wrong ways. And what about now? She asked, her voice trembling. Why are you telling me this now? Adrian's eyes softened as he looked at her, his gaze filled with sincerity. Because I can't keep hiding from my mistakes, he said. You deserve to know the truth, and because I still care about you, Claire. More than anything, I want to make things right if you'll let me. Claire shook her head, her emotions overwhelming her. You can't just walk back into my life and expect me to forget everything that happened, she said. It's not that simple. I know it's not, Adrian said, his voice steady, and I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. But I want to be here for you and the baby. I want to prove to you that I'm not the same man who walked away. She looked at him, searching his face for any signs of insincerity, but all she saw was a man who was genuinely trying to make amends. A man who had made mistakes, but was willing to do whatever it took to fix them. I don't know if I can trust you again, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to trust me right now, Adrian said. All I'm asking for is a chance to show you that I mean what I say, to prove to you that I'm not going anywhere this time. Claire turned away, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to push him away, to hold on to her anger and resentment. But another part of her, the part that still cared for him, wanted to believe that people could change, that second chances were possible. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. I don't know if things can ever go back to the way they were, but for the baby's sake, I'll give you a chance to prove yourself. Adrian's shoulders sagged with relief, and he nodded. Thank you, he said sincerely. I won't let you down, Claire. As they stood in the quiet living room, the weight of their shared past still lingering between them, Claire couldn't help but wonder if Adrian's selfless act of love could be the first step toward healing their broken relationship. Only time would tell. Claire woke up to the sound of soft rain pattering against the windows of the mansion. She had been recovering steadily under Adrian's watchful care, though her heart still waged a silent battle. The mansion, once a place of pain and resentment, now felt more like a sanctuary, a confusing blend of comfort and unresolved emotions. One afternoon, as she wandered through the sprawling house, trying to distract herself from her own thoughts, she found herself drawn to Adrian's study. The door was slightly ajar, and curiosity got the better of her. She pushed it open gently, stepping inside. The room smelled of cedarwood and faint traces of Adrian's cologne. The large oak desk was stacked with documents and ledgers, but what caught her attention was a small leather box tucked in a corner. Something about it seemed personal, almost sacred. Claire hesitated for a moment, debating whether she should even touch it, but the pull of curiosity was too strong. Slowly she opened the box and found a stack of letters neatly tied with a ribbon. On top of the pile was an envelope with her name written in Adrian's unmistakable handwriting. Her heart skipped a beat. It was dated 6 months after their divorce, a time when she had been drowning in sorrow and struggling to move forward. She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should invade what was clearly meant to be private. But the sight of her name, written with such care, made her fingers tremble as she opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. The words on the page blurred for a moment as tears welled up in her eyes. Taking a deep breath, she began to read. Dear Claire, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to put these words down, even if they never leave this room. First, I want to say that I am sorry. Sorry for everything. For leaving you, for shutting you out, and for not being the man you deserved. I have replayed every moment of our time together, every mistake I made, and it kills me to know how deeply I hurt you. I told myself I was doing the right thing by letting you go. I thought I was protecting you from the mess my life had become. The business was collapsing, my family was falling apart, and I felt like a failure. How could I ask you to stay when I couldn't even promise you a stable future? But now I see how wrong I was. Claire, you didn't need perfection or wealth. You needed me, and I failed to see that. I failed to trust in the strength of our love. There's not a single day that goes by when I don't miss you. Your laugh, your smile, the way you used to hum to yourself when you thought no one was listening. You brought light into my life, and I let it slip through my fingers. I wish I could turn back time. I wish I could hold you and tell you how much you mean to me. I wish I could tell you that letting you go was the hardest thing I've ever done. But most of all, I wish I could tell you that I never stopped loving you. I still love you, Claire, with every piece of my broken heart. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I don't expect it. But if there's even the smallest chance for us to find our way back to each other, I would do anything to make it happen. Yours, always, Adrian. Claire's hands trembled as she finished reading, tears streaming down her face. The letter fell to her lap as she stared blankly at the desk, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She had spent so long believing that Adrian had walked away without a second thought, but this letter painted a completely different picture. Adrian had been suffering too. He had loved her even when he thought he was protecting her by leaving. She clutched the letter to her chest, feeling a strange mixture of pain and hope. All the walls she had built around her heart, all the resentment she had clung to, suddenly felt fragile. The depth of Adrian's regret and love was laid bare in those words, and it shook her to her core. Just as she was trying to compose herself, the door to the study creaked open. She looked up to see Adrian standing there, his expression a mix of surprise and concern. "Claire," he said softly, stepping into the room. "What are you doing in here?" She held up the letter, her voice trembling. "I found this," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "You wrote this, and you never sent it?" Adrian's face paled as he realized what she was holding. He rubbed the back of his neck, his usual calm demeanor faltering. I didn't think it would make a difference," he admitted. "I thought it would only make things harder for you." Claire stood, clutching the letter tightly. "Adrian, this changes everything," she said, her voice breaking. His eyes softened as he stepped closer to her. "I meant every word," he said, earnestly. "I still do, but I didn't want to burden you with my regrets. You deserve to move on, to find happiness, even if it wasn't with me." Claire shook her head, fresh tears spilling over. "You thought you were protecting me, but all you did was push me away," she said. "Do you know how many nights I cried myself to sleep, wondering why I wasn't enough for you? Why you didn't fight for me?" Adrian's face crumpled with guilt, and he reached for her hand. "You were more than enough, Claire. You were everything. I was the one who wasn't enough. I let my fears and insecurities cloud my judgment, and I hurt you in the process. I will never forgive myself for that." Claire looked at him, her heart aching at the raw vulnerability in his eyes. For the first time, she saw not the billionaire with the stoic demeanor, but the man she had fallen in love with, the man who had always tried to protect her, even in the wrong ways. "I don't know if I can forget everything that's happened," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm not asking you to," Adrian said, his voice steady. "I know it will take time, but I'm here, Claire. I'm not going anywhere, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving to you that I'm the man you deserve." Claire looked down at the letter in her hand, her fingers tracing the edges of the paper. The words written there had reopened wounds she thought had healed, but they had also planted a seed of hope. "Maybe," she said softly, "there's still a chance for us to rewrite our story." Adrian's eyes lit up with a mixture of hope and relief. "I'll do whatever it takes," he promised. As they stood in the quiet study, surrounded by the weight of their shared past, Claire felt the first flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope for the future. The mansion groaned under the weight of a raging thunderstorm. Rain lashed against the windows in relentless sheets, and the deep rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. Claire sat in the living room, her hand resting gently on her belly as she watched the storm. The flashes of lightning illuminated the concern etched on her face. She had been feeling strange all day, a dull ache in her lower back and an unusual tightness in her abdomen. Adrian entered the room, holding 2 steaming mugs of tea. "Thought you might want something warm," he said, placing one on the table beside her. His eyes softened when he saw her troubled expression. "You okay?" Claire hesitated before nodding. "I'm fine," she said, Though her voice lacked conviction, Adrian crouched beside her, his gaze searching her face. "Claire, if something's wrong, you need to tell me." She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, a sharp pain shot through her abdomen. She gasped, clutching her belly as her face contorted in pain. "Claire!" Adrian's voice was filled with panic as he grabbed her shoulders. "What's wrong? Is it the baby?" I don't know," she stammered, breathing heavily as the pain subsided. "It could be Braxton Hicks, but it feels different." Adrian didn't wait for more information. "We're going to the hospital," he said firmly, already grabbing her coat. "Adrian, it's probably nothing," Claire protested weakly, but another wave of pain cut her off. "That's it," Adrian said, determination in his eyes. "We're leaving. Now." The drive to the hospital was harrowing. The rain poured down in torrents, making visibility nearly impossible. Adrian gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white as he navigated the slick roads. Claire sat in the passenger seat, gripping the edge of her seat as the contractions grew more frequent and intense. "Breathe, Claire," Adrian said, his voice both soothing and urgent. "We're almost there." "I'm trying," she gasped, her breaths coming in short, sharp bursts. "It hurts, Adrian. It really hurts." Adrian's heart broke at the sight of her in pain. "I'm here," he said, glancing at her briefly. "I'm not going anywhere." Another contraction hit, and Claire let out a cry, her hand clutching Adrian's arm for support. He flinched at the strength of her grip, but didn't say a word. His only focus was getting her to the hospital safely. When they finally arrived, Adrian screeched to a halt in front of the emergency entrance. Nurses and a doctor rushed out with a wheelchair, and Adrian helped Claire into it. "She's in labor," he told them, his voice frantic. "Please, help her." In the delivery room, the storm outside seemed to mirror the chaos within. Claire was in active labor, her cries echoing through the sterile room as the medical team worked to ensure both her and the baby's safety. Adrian stood by her side, holding her hand tightly. "You're doing amazing, Claire," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gripping his heart. "I'm right here." Claire glared at him through the haze of pain. "You did this to me," she hissed, her tone a mixture of pain and humor. Adrian couldn't help but chuckle, though his eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I'll take full responsibility," he said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her sweat-soaked face. As the contractions grew stronger, Claire's strength began to wane. "I can't do this," she gasped, her voice barely audible. "Yes, you can," Adrian said firmly, his grip on her hand tightening. "You're the strongest person I know, Claire. You've got this. Just a little more, okay?" She looked at him, her eyes filled with fear and pain, but his unwavering support gave her the courage to keep going. Hours passed, and finally, the doctor announced that the baby was crowning. "One more push, Claire," he said encouragingly. Adrian leaned close to her, his voice soft and steady. "You're almost there. Just one more and we'll meet our baby." With every ounce of strength she had left, Claire gave one final push, her scream filling the room. Then suddenly the room was filled with a new sound, the sharp, piercing cry of a newborn. "It's a boy!" the doctor announced, holding up the tiny, wriggling baby. Claire collapsed back against the bed, tears streaming down her face as the nurse placed the baby on her chest. She looked down at her son, her heart swelling with a love so profound it left her breathless. Adrian stood frozen for a moment, his eyes fixed on the baby. Slowly he reached out, his hands trembling as he took the tiny bundle from Claire. "He's perfect," Adrian whispered, his voice breaking. Tears streamed down his face as he cradled his son, his heart overwhelmed by the moment. "Claire, we made him. He's ours," Claire smiled weakly. her exhaustion evident, but her joy unmistakable. "He's beautiful," she said softly, reaching out to touch the baby's tiny hand. Adrian sat beside her, still holding the baby as though he were the most precious thing in the world. "I promise you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I will never let either of you down again. I will spend the rest of my life making sure you're both safe and loved." Claire looked at him, her heart swelling with a mix of love and hope. For the first time in a long time, she felt like they were truly a family. As the storm outside began to subside, the three of them sat together in the quiet hospital room. The rain had washed away the pain and resentment of the past, leaving behind a sense of peace and new beginnings. Adrian looked down at his son, then at Claire, and smiled through his tears. "Thank you," he whispered, "for giving me a second chance, for giving me this." Claire reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "We'll figure this out together," she said softly. And in that moment, as the first rays of dawn began to break through the clouds, their hearts were filled with hope for the future, a future they would face together as a family. The weeks following the birth of their son were a whirlwind of sleepless nights, soft cries, and moments that seemed to stretch endlessly, yet pass in the blink of an eye. Claire and Adrian, despite their turbulent history, found themselves leaning on each other in ways they never had before. Parenthood had woven an unspoken bond between them, a bond made stronger by the trials they had endured together. The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains of Adrian's mansion as Claire rocked their baby in her arms. The soft, cooing sounds of their son brought a small smile to her lips, but her thoughts lingered on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She still carried scars from the pain of the past, but every glance at Adrian, every tender moment he shared with their son, chipped away at the walls she had built around her heart. Adrian entered the room quietly, careful not to wake the baby. He stopped in the doorway, watching Claire with an expression that held both admiration and regret. She was bathed in the golden light of the morning, her face softened by a serenity he hadn't seen in years. "You're staring again," Claire said without looking up, a teasing lilt in her voice. Adrian stepped closer, a sheepish smile on his face. "I can't help it," he admitted. "You're incredible." Claire glanced up at him, her expression unreadable. "I'm just doing what any mother would do." "No," Adrian said, his voice firm yet gentle. "You're doing so much more. Claire, I don't know how you found the strength to forgive me, to let me back into your life after everything." She looked down at their son, brushing her thumb gently across his tiny cheek. "It wasn't easy," she said softly. "But I realized something. Holding on to anger was only hurting me. And if we're going to give our son the life he deserves, we can't be stuck in the past." Adrian knelt beside her, his eyes filled with emotion. "I promise you, Claire, I will never give you a reason to doubt me again. I will spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worthy of your forgiveness." Claire looked into his eyes, seeing the sincerity there. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of her pain begin to lift. "Then, let's start over," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "Not just for him, but for us." The decision to rebuild their relationship wasn't without its challenges. Trust was fragile, and the wounds of the past couldn't be erased overnight. But Adrian was determined to make amends. He made a conscious effort to be present, whether it was changing diapers, staying up during late-night feedings, or simply sitting beside Claire as they watched their baby sleep. Claire, too, found herself softening toward Adrian. She saw the man she had fallen in love with slowly re-emerge, the man who once danced with her in the kitchen, who wrote her love notes on napkins, who would have moved mountains to make her smile. One afternoon, as they sat on the couch, their son sleeping soundly in Adrian's arms, Claire spoke the words she hadn't dared to say in years. "I still love you, Adrian," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian looked at her, his eyes widening in surprise and hope. "Claire, I'm not saying it's going to be easy," she continued, her gaze steady, "but I'm willing to try. I want us to be a family, for him and for us." Adrian's heart swelled with emotion. He leaned forward, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "You have no idea what that means to me," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. Months passed, and their lives began to take on a new rhythm. The once cold mansion was now filled with laughter, the sound of a baby's giggles echoing through its halls. Adrian and Claire spent their days discovering the joy of parenthood together, taking turns feeding their son, marveling at his first smiles, and debating who he resembled more. Adrian worked tirelessly to balance his business obligations with his newfound role as a father and partner. He made it a point to come home early every day, leaving behind the world of boardrooms and contracts to spend time with his family. One sunny morning, Adrian suggested they spend the day in the garden. "It's beautiful outside," he said, cradling their son in his arms. "Let's take him out to see the world." Claire smiled, nodding in agreement. They set up a blanket under the shade of a large oak tree, the warm sun casting dappled patterns on the grass. Their son lay on the blanket, his tiny hands reaching out to the world around him. Adrian and Claire sat beside him, their shoulders brushing as they watched their baby's every move. "Look," Claire said suddenly, pointing to a butterfly that had landed nearby. The baby's eyes lit up with wonder as the butterfly fluttered its wings. He reached out with chubby fingers, a delighted squeal escaping his lips. Adrian chuckled, his heart swelling with pride and joy. "He's already curious about the world," he said, glancing at Claire, "just like his mother." Claire laughed softly, her hand finding Adrian's. "Or stubborn, like his father." They shared a smile, the kind that spoke of unspoken promises and a future filled with hope. As the afternoon wore on, the three of them sat in the garden, their laughter mingling with the rustling leaves and the distant chirping of birds. The storm that had once overshadowed their lives had passed, leaving behind a clear sky and a renewed sense of purpose. Adrian looked at Claire, his heart full of gratitude. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" she asked, tilting her head. "For giving me a second chance. For believing in me. For this," he said, gesturing to their son. Claire squeezed his hand, her eyes shining with emotion. "We gave each other a second chance," she said, "and I wouldn't have it any other way." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Claire rested her head on Adrian's shoulder, their baby nestled between them. It wasn't a perfect journey, and there were still challenges ahead. But for the first time in a long time, Claire and Adrian felt whole. They had found their way back to each other, not just as lovers, but as partners and parents. And as their son reached out toward the butterfly once more, his innocent laughter filling the air, they knew they had built a new beginning, one grounded in love, resilience, and the promise of a brighter future.